Along a wend, whipped shoreline where gulls carry rumour like salt, a weathered stone crouches between rock and bracken. It bears 2 names and a cold date, a stub of memory many prefer to avoid. The fishermen cross themselves. The innkeepers lock doors a little earlier. The names whispered in half voices are Ezekiel and Judith Harrington, siblings who took vows not of faith but of fortune. They married not for love but for ledger lines, binding kin to kin so the wealth they harvested from accusation could never drift to strangers. Their union was a legal maneuver disguised as sanctity, a seal to keep curious hands from the accounts they compiled with quiet cruelty. They learned the grammar of suspicion as a trade. In parishes where superstition burned as bright as hearthfire, the Harrows supplied what no market could print, a verdict. Ezekiel cultivated presence and menace. Judith mastered suggestion and silent pressure, planting words in neighborly ears that became evidence. They moved as surgical predators through villages, identifying which widow owned the mill that would feed their coffers, which farmer tended the pasture nearest the road. When Judith's pregnancy arrived, the household prepared with the unnatural caution of conspirators. Fine wood for cradles was ordered, linens sent from the city, medicines bought at high cost to ensure secrecy. They wanted heirs who would keep the line unbroken, heirs who would inherit not only lands, but the pattern of accusation and control. The midwife who accepted their fee did so with trembling hopes and a ledger of her own. Labor came like a sentence, long, private, final. There were sounds in that room later called cruelly inexplicable. When the twins emerged, they did not fit the models of the day. Limbs grew in odd relation. Faces registered angles that made midwives avert their eyes. Yet alongside deformity there was a clarity, a responsiveness that unsettled adults who had expected only silence. The children watched, measured, and somehow absorbed secrets. Before I unspool all the Harrows tried to bury, join the channel, linger, and bring others. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you, and tell me where you are listening from. This tale wants place. It feeds on the geography of fear. They practiced law like liturgy, forging documents, bribing clerks, corrupting ministers. Each signature stitched a safety net. Nets fray. The Harrows feared dilution of claim, the scattering of papers, a neighbor who remembered. Their solution would demand a secrecy darker than rumor and blood debts remain. The Harrows perfected accusation into a revenue model. They traveled like accountants of damnation, arriving in towns whose misfortunes were ready, made narratives a blighted crop, a stillborn foal, a fever that took a child. Ezekiel proclaimed learned signs, Judith performed examinations, and coaxed witnesses into memory with a firmness that looked like certainty. They always knew which house would interest rumor, a widow with property, an inconsequential tradesman sitting on a river ford. They kept notes like priests keep scripture, meticulous lists of who owed what, who could be coerced, who would lie for shelter. They bribed clerks, blackmailed servants, used the language of piety to hide bookkeeping. The first price paid was someone else's life, but the harvest was property, and property is how power roots itself. When a verdict went their way, beneficiaries were rarely visible. Trustees and silent partners held titles that traced back to a hidden ledger no magistrate could read without undue effort. At home, the twins watched. Kept in a wing of the manor ostensibly for privacy, they became the Harrows' secret insurance. The siblings assumed the twins' deformities were a badge to conceal. Instead, the twins converted the family's arrogance into education. They taught themselves to read by peering at receipts and letters left unattended. By 4 they could decipher decimals, and by 5 they could find names in index lists. The isolation of their chamber sharpened memory like whetstone. Their lessons were not taught. They were learned through observation, through the cadence of confiding voices, through the placement of ledgers behind false panels, through the rhythm of orchards and toll receipts. When servants moved papers, the twins memorized patterns. When Ezekiel dictated names to Judith, the children troubled over syllables as if unpacking a cipher. The Harrows had meant to keep their children small and passive. They had not calculated curiosity's hunger. A new servant arrived from a village scarred by choices the Harrows had pocketed. Margaret Caldwell, observant and hungry, came to scrub halls and feed children. She noticed odd ledger placements and secret drawers. Small notes began to appear where she cleaned. thin scrawl and arrows pointing to false backs. The twins could not speak openly, they could only write. Margaret arrived with pockets empty of options and a practical resolve. She had known hunger, she had tended graves. Walking in the Harrow manor, she saw the world from angles the family never expected, under carpets, behind false wainscoting, between bindings of account ledgers left to air. The first note was a clumsy scratch beneath a broom closet find LEDGR. Over weeks those scratches became sentences. They taught her where to look and, more dangerously, how to stay calm. The twins taught Margaret a literacy of hiding. Messages were tucked into dust bunnies, slipped under seal wax, folded inside a cushion seam. They wrote with hands that trembled but spelled without error. The content shifted from names to numbers to coded directions, a page number, a ledger entry, an amount paid, a place where a property deed had been diverted to a shell trustee. Margaret began copying pages onto her own scraps, always aware that discovery meant a fate she could not survive. Outside the manor, the Harrows continued their righteous choreography. Ezekiel lectured on signs of maleficence, Judith indicted and curated witnesses. Together they stitched a courtroom costume that convinced magistrates and merchants. They cultivated allies among men who profited from redistributed property, men relieved to see neighbors fall. The Harrows' method required more than cruelty, it required plausible ritual and plausible motive. Margaret's copies accumulated in a trunk beneath the floorboards of her garret. She sought counsel with a priest she barely trusted, a man who had come to town with a wary eye and contacts, Father Benedict Thorne. He had training beyond parish comfort, an ability to read patterns where others saw only chaos. His first glance at Margaret's fragments made him cold. Names matched those muttered in confessionals, numbers connected to accounts rumored in taverns. The twins had shown Margaret a hidden panel under Ezekiel's desk and pointed to a page number. They taught her a sequence of knocks to mark when it was safe. This made the ledger attainable, if she could retrieve it unseen, truly. Father Benedict arrived under pretense of pastoral duty and left as something sharper. An investigator with moral authority, he carried himself like a man who had read too many confessions and learned patterns from them. When he first asked to see the children, Ezekiel smiled as if the request were pious. Judith assented because ministers soothe suspicion. In the curtained room, Benedict saw not hollow infants but two minds cataloguing nuance and detail. They did not speak plainly, trained into silence by pity and design. They let hands do the talking and eyes hang like questions. Benedict tested them with theological riddles, with sums and scripture. The twins answered with patient scribbles and taps. With an economy of gesture that betrayed years of listening, they pointed to dates, names, amounts. They revealed a code of knocks and paper folds they had invented to make memory reliable. It was Benedict who suggested a communal acknowledgement to pierce secrecy, to declare aloud in witness that the veil between concealment and justice had torn. He told Margaret the formula, not as superstition but as civic binding type, the veils broken twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Do not treat it as charm, treat it as recognition. The act would not change documents, but would change the community's willingness to look. Benedict moved cautiously, assembling affidavits, subpoenaing account copies from mercantile houses, and recruiting craftsmen who remembered trades and deeds. He pursued a confession from a man who had once helped stage trials. Marcus Fletcher, bitter and ruined, opened under pressure and offered a narrative matching Margaret's copies. What remained was physical proof, the ledger, hidden behind the false panel, tied with a ribbon Ezekiel used himself. Retrieving that ledger required risk. Margaret would bypass sleeping servants, time her movements to household rhythms, and use the sequence of knocks the twins had taught her. Benedict arranged decoys, distractions in the kitchen and false errands for maids. Every step was slow because the Harrows still commanded sympathy in pockets of the county. The twins watched preparations with a precision that unnerved Benedict. They knew the household's footfalls, the timing of lantern snuffings, even which dog would bark at midnight. Their silence had become a map. Margaret held the needle, and steadiness. Night was a thin sheet over the manor when Margaret slipped from her garret. She moved as taught, 3 soft steps along the corridor, a pause at the servants' rooms, then the sequence of knocks under Ezekiel's study. The hidden panel yielded. Her fingers found a ribbon and a bound ledger, its edges dusted with years of concealment. She copied pages with trembling haste and folded them into her apron. Each line read like a litany: payments to witnesses, entries for bribes, sums routed to names that were fronts. She found symbols Ezekiel used to mark pliant jurors and initials pointing toward ministers who had received favors. For an hour she worked under the pulse of the household, knowing discovery meant ruin. She fled with the pages tucked close, returning to the garret where Father Benedict waited in darkness with a lantern. He handled the papers like relics, reading columns and checking marginalia. Each matched sum and name mapped a pattern of transaction and motive. Benedict whispered plans and instructed Margaret on transferring copies to those wronged. He arranged meetings with villagers who had lost land, interviewed men named familiar faces, neighbors who had testified and been rewarded with leases, artisans paid for services never rendered. Marcus Fletcher's earlier confession now found corroboration in ink. The web the Harrows had woven showed its knots. Yet the Harrows reacted not with immediate flight but with countermeasures. Judith amplified public piety, hosting prayer hours and distributing alms to grieving families. Ezekiel challenged the chain of custody, accusing Margaret of theft and slander, casting doubt on the papers. In courts designed for the convincing, an accused servant meant little. The Harrows played to sympathy and to a legal system whose design favored property over accusation rebuttal. As news spread, neighbors convened in hushed circles, weighing loyalty, fear, and the calculus of material loss. Some who profited from the Harrows petitioned for calm, others who had suffered began to ask questions. The twins kept from public gaze, tracked the ripple with vigilance. Every petition filed and every lawyer consulted was noted and stored like a new cipher. The trial did not begin as a clean unfolding of facts. Proceedings in county halls resemble ritual, and ritual is a stage that rewards those fluent in costume. The Harrows arrived with an arsenal of sympathy. Judith wore black and tears. Ezekiel spoke of piety betrayed by rumor. Their allies produced fainting widows and a reverend who attested to their charity. The court thirsted for narrative coherence, and the Harrows furnished sermons about order, sin, and the chaos of accusation. Benedict and Margaret presented paper and witness, but paper in these counties is a fragile armor. The Harrows' lawyers drilled into chain of custody, questioning each transfer of pages, each hidden seam where Margaret had placed copies. They painted Margaret as an opportunist, an illiterate servant who stitched stories from overheard gossip. Yet when Marcus Fletcher took the stand, his face told a different story. He spoke of coached testimony, of payments made in linen and coin, of nights he had staged certain testimonies for favors. The court shuddered at Marcus's precise detail. Names he supplied matched marginalia in the ledger. When Benedict produced the original bound account taken from Ezekiel's desk, the volume itself carried handwriting that mirrored Ezekiel's known scrawl, a flourish, a particular loop. That visual match cut deeper than words. Jurors squinted at ink and at initials, and for the first time community respect seemed to slip like wax from an altar. But the Harrows had other levers. They summoned depositions from merchants in neighboring shires, who claimed to have received debts owed to them instead of to widows. They produced receipts that seemed to contradict ledger entries, and more subtly, they invoked the rot of gossip. They argued that in a world of superstition, a servant's accusation is an explosive thing that can ruin reputations without cause. The judge, himself a man accustomed to property disputes, hesitated at the possibility of upheaval. Between motions, Ezekiel wrote letters, subtle threats to officials, promises of patronage, veiled references to secrets that could unsettle reputations. Judith directed witnesses with a surgeon's hand, coaching memory into narrative. The case became a tightrope. In the audience, the twins sat in a corner where they could be seen but not expected to speak, their faces a strange ledger of attention. Not law alone broke them, but exposed ledger knots. Finally, the revelation happened not in dramatic shouting, but in a quiet demonstration that left the court rearranged. Benedict requested the judge permit a private reading of certain ledger pages, an allowance framed as procedural. The judge agreed. In the private clerk's room, with the courtroom's hum beyond a wall, Benedict and a panel of elders compared handwriting, caught the peculiar loops, and matched marginal annotations with Marcus Fletcher's account. The confidence in the Harrows' performance began to unravel. What followed was the exposure of a ledger entry so explicit that it read like motive in inky payment to a named juror, description of testimony to be offered, a notation about the division of confiscated land. The entry's clarity made plausible explanation impossible. When Benedict presented witness affidavits from those who had been dispossessed, the ledger's lines translated rumor into design. The judge called for pauses for council conferences. Townspeople outside pressed in doorways and whispered together. The Harrows retaliated with legal maneuvers designed for delay. They filed countersuits claiming defamation. They pressed for publication of accusations against Margaret and Benedict, framing themselves as victims of slander. Yet the physical ledger had a stubbornness paper rarely possesses. Merchant houses that had received payments found themselves subpoenaed. Men who had accepted leases that night had to account for receipts. The Harrows' network, which had seemed like an invisible lattice, was now a visible mesh. In that steady, suffocating movement from whisper to list to evidence, something older than the Harrows appeared, a pattern of institutional appetite where accusation feeds acquisition, where law can be wielded as a blade as readily as a shield. The twins had learned this pattern as children. They had learned the quiet seams where power lifts and property slides. Their knowledge would not only indict their parents but expose a method, a technology of social control that had been refined over decades. The Harrows, feeling walls close, moved to reroute titles, convey lands into names of distant kin, and prepare a private settlement that would keep the fortune beyond public reach yet. The Harrows' last calculation was brutal in its logic and simple in its cruelty. If the law would seize assets tied to their names, they would sever the chain by burying property in other names. Distant cousins, shell trustees, payments labeled as charity. Far more vicious was the plan to use their children as instruments to register the twins under guardianship with allies who would hold the titles until the storm passed. In private, the siblings argued that a child's legal tie could mask a fortune forever. When word of these maneuvers leaked, the county's outrage shifted to a new fury. People who had only recently begun to recognize themselves as victims understood the stakes. The possibility that stolen lands would be spirited beyond reach provoked a fear that cut deeper than sorrow. It was a fear of permanent dispossession. Benedict pressed the court not just for restitution, but for a restraint that would block any transfer of title until adjudication finished. In the midst of these legal skirmishes, the twins became actors in a drama they had not solicited. Ezekiel insisted appearances be maintained. Judith arranged for guardianship paperwork to be drafted under the hand of a friendly magistrate. The twins appeared at depositions wrapped in shawls, their hands hidden, their eyes watching for openings. Margaret continued to ferry scrap copies of ledger pages to safe hands. Before we go deeper into this forbidden tale, subscribe to this channel, because the truths we uncover here are the ones history tried to bury, and you deserve to know them first. Benedict suggested a symbolic act to galvanize support among townsfolk, an act the audience would understand as civic binding. He asked those who followed this tale to bind themselves to memory with a small, public ritual type. The veil is broken twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. This was not magic but record. It was a public acknowledgement meant to build a chorus that could not be silenced as easily as a single servant. The ritual worked as a mirror. When enough voices repeated it, the social field shifted and more villagers felt warranted in speaking. Seeing the narrowing of options, the Harrows tried a harsh attack. They bribed a magistrate to delay hearings and threatened legal reprisals against those who testified. They also arranged for a private physician to pronounce the twins incapable of coherent testimony, a medical verdict designed to mute their value as witnesses. Benedict would not relent. Benedict's audacious plan was simple in structure and ruthless in effect: make the twins' knowledge undeniable without exposing them to the raw violence of public speech. He arranged a coded demonstration in the church, where piety and publicity intersected, and invited those who had lost land and those who had authority to witness. Margaret would place selected ledger pages on the pulpit. Benedict would read names aloud while the accused lands were called to stand. The twins, positioned in a bright window, became the quiet axis of the event. The trick was to let actions speak louder than argument. Benedict read entries and then walked the congregation through the map of ownership. These names corresponded to a mill. That name matched a pasture. These initials hid the juror who had once presided. When people began to call out the places they had lost, the ledger's lines moved from ink into lived reality. Men and women in that church recognized deeds and called for restoration. The sound of recovered memory was a kind of thunder. The Harrows could not respond with simple denials once a dozen hands rose to contest titles. They tried legal counters and outraged sermons. They whispered that Benedict had trafficked in rumor. They claimed Margaret had stolen pages and forged entries. But the congregation had seen the sequence. A ledger page matched a testimony which matched a bounded plot. Men who earlier had testified for the Harrows found the courage to recant. Some swore they had been bribed, some that they had been coached. Yet power does not capitulate without cost. The Harrows employed threats. Margaret received anonymous notes. Benedict found his horse's harness slashed. Supporters who spoke up found sudden misfortune in their fields. The Harrows leaned on local contacts to obstruct enforcement of provisional restitutions. They appealed to higher courts. They delayed. Even as the church's moral reckoning gathered force, the legal and economic levers the Harrows controlled slowed the wheels of justice. They planned to target the registry, interrupt transfers by planting irrefutable proof at first light. At first light, the operation moved with the precision of a lock-picking crew. Benedict, Margaret, a modest group of wronged villagers, and the twins acting as quiet directors, approached the registry under the pretense of commerce. The registry clerk, a man who had long accepted bribes in coin or favor, was interrupted as Benedict presented fresh claims and asked for an immediate inventory. While the clerk argued procedure, Margaret slipped into the stacks and located the folios that indexed land transfers. The twins had prepared exact citations, volume numbers, page lines, the clerk's own marginal notes where he had recorded handoffs. They instructed Margaret where to look and how to pull files without invoking alarm. Benedict read aloud the ledger entries that matched the Harrows' signatures while villagers circled the clerk's desk. The confrontation was legal theater and moral pressure fused. The clerk, surrounded by people demanding accountability, faltered. In the stacks, Margaret found evidence of hurried transfers, deeds dated suspiciously just before trials, signatures replaced with marks, and notation that payments had been routed through shell accounts. She copied each item into a new ledger of her own, while Benedict notarized affidavits and villagers swore to their recognition. The clerk could not deny the parallel between the Harrows' ledger and the registry's entries once multiple witnesses identified the same plots and the same trades. Still, the Harrows' reach extended beyond the county's front doors. They had friends in the merchant houses and a network of agents who could smother enforcement with appeals and paperwork. Days after the registry action, injunctions slowed repossessions, but so too did threats intensify. Ezekiel arranged for a hired thug to appear at Benedict's rectory late at night. Judith offered coin to anyone willing to vouch again for their piety. The Harrows were not yet undone. They were wounded and enraged, and they also saw the deeper architecture, a culture where accusation and recompense were techniques passed through networks. Magistrates, merchants, ministers, each playing parts in a system that fed on fear and rewarded complicity and secrecy. What the Harrows exemplified was not anomalous wickedness, but a technique of social engineering that had existed in various guises for generations. Accusation is an instrument. Once calibrated, it bends communities toward a predictable outcome. Name someone as dangerous, entrench fear, and property will change hands as if by natural law. The Harrows refined this instrument into a craft: identify seams in social trust, exploit religious fervor, stage evidence, then harvest the legal fallout. It is a cold arithmetic. Consider how institutions magnify such techniques. A magistrate dependent on patronage will be slow to offend a powerful family. A banker who profits from loans will prefer stability to moral clarity. A minister who receives alms from patrons will look away from accusations that benefit benefactors. These are not conspiratorial fantasies, but structural incentives. The Harrows did not create corruption. They recognized where it already lived and learned to speak its language. The twins internalized these lessons not in sermon or lecture, but in a kind of cold apprenticeship. Isolated, they studied ledgers, memorized names, and rehearsed the cascade of cause and effect. A bribe here, a coerced testimony there, a property transferred to a nominee. They translated social patterns into arithmetic and then into strategies. When Benedict and Margaret harnessed this knowledge, it became a weapon, not of revenge but of repair. That weapon required steady hands and patient networks. Benedict's ecclesiastical connections reached into merchant houses. Margaret's copies were entrusted to tradesmen in different villages who would attest under oath. Citizens who had lost mills and fields were taught how to organize their memories into testimony. The process revealed something uglier. Many who had benefited from the Harrows system were themselves victims of habits they did not wish to unlearn. Giving up profit is difficult, retraction is costly. So justice became not a single verdict, but a long campaign of civic education and legal pressure. The twins' role evolved from secret informants to living indexes of a method. Their deformity, which had initially been a mark to be hidden, became a kind of shield and a prism. People could not easily dismiss what was plainly there, and that visibility made lies harder to sustain. Even as institutions changed, scars remained, habits persisted. Over years, the Harrows' public dominance eroded, but not in a neat collapse. Legal victories were earned slowly and imperfectly. Some properties were restored, others were tangled in appeals or disappeared into evasions. Ezekiel and Judith lost certain titles, but they maintained influence in subtler ways through marriage ties, through men who still remembered favors, through accounts laundered into offshore ledgers beyond easy reach. Power rarely vanishes, it migrates, reappearing under new names with familiar structures. The twins matured into their roles as living archives. Their physical constraints remained acute, but their minds expanded to hold social maps more intricate than any ledger. They became modest teachers to those who would listen, instructing the newly organized committees on how to track transfers, how to preserve chain of custody, and how to translate memory into admissible testimony. Some called their work odd, others called it salvation. For families that had lost land, the twins were a blunt and necessary remedy, yet their prominence made them targets of a different sort. Agents of the Harrows' remaining allies shadowed dealings, seeking any leverage to reassert advantage. The twins received letters of warning. Margaret was harried by legal countersuits that blurred her coffers. Benedict suffered ecclesiastical slander from factions that resented his meddling. The campaign to dismantle the apparatus relied on endurance, steady testimony, repeated depositions, and communities willing to weather economic coercion. As the twins' renown grew, so too did the appetite of those who saw them as curiosities or as unnatural signs. Some villagers treated them as oracles, others avoided their gaze. The twins learned to use their visibility as a protective device. When a rescinding deed was read in court, when a registrar scratched a name off a page and returned it to a wronged hand, the twins sat in the public gallery and let the room's knowledge make it harder to return to denial. But not all truths endure. Even as statutes changed and some restitutions were made, many records fell into damp cellars and others into private chests. The twins named names beyond the county, suggesting a network spanning ports and courts and merchants. The twins' revelations reached beyond the county and into ports, where ledgers change hands with fewer questions. Names surfaced that suggested the Harrows had been small nodes in a broader lattice of opportunistic families and compliant officials. Merchant firms in the city had absorbed ill-gotten rents, inland magistrates had been nudged by gifts, ministers had been cued to produce charity testimonies on cue. The pattern resembled a machinery, a social technology designed to turn accusation into capital. This knowledge made powerful men uneasy. Exposure threatened established flows of wealth that were seldom pure, and institutions prefer quiet flows to scandal. Some who recognized kinship with the Harrows' methods sought to buy silence. Others sought to reframe the narrative by arguing that economic turbulence requires firm hands. Still, the twins distributed copies of ledgers, and the corroborated witness networks turned private deals into public liabilities. Ports found themselves reviewing consignments and accounts with new scrutiny. There were darker whispers as well, of rituals that had once accompanied property transfers, of symbolic acts that made communities believe a moral cause existed. The Harrows had practiced theater processions, prayers, and the careful timing of calamity to create narrative structures. The twins posited that these were not mere superstition, but techniques of control, forms of psychological pressure that normalized dispossession. Once you accept that fear can be manufactured, you see how institutions become complicit in maintenance. Merchants and magistrates who felt exposed used their clout to resist reforms. They delayed hearings, appealed to distant courts, and bought legal opinions from Metropolitan Council. Infrastructure of evasion was sophisticated trusts disguised as charities, convoluted chains of sale, and emissaries who would swear to past dealings. The Harrows' methods had been a prototype of this economy. The twins, small and physically constrained, found themselves facing not only legal argument but an entrenched culture of concealment. Yet for every attempt to silence them, new voices rose. Families once dispossessed began to compile their memories into lists. Younger men trained in bookkeeping learned to follow paper trails. Clergy who feared institutional compromise chose conscience over convenience. The twins' slow campaign became an education movement, teaching people to read the lines others had used to mark their losses. Over time, these habits produced folklore, local registers that survived war, public memorials to wronged families, and a wary civic memory that sometimes prevented similar schemes from taking root, plus oral testimony after years of hearings, appeals, and the slow grind of law. A reckoning arrived that balanced on compromise. The Harrows could not hold all they had held. Judges ordered restitution for several estates and invalidated a series of corrupted transfers. Titles reverted, mills and fields returned to families who had known only absence. Ezekiel and Judith were stripped of some offices and fined. Some allies were removed from positions of trust. It was, in parts, a vindication. Yet justice wore the shape of the institutions that delivered it. Some property remained elusive, swallowed by intermediaries who had rearranged papers with care. The Harrows' wealth was diminished but not destroyed. They paid fines, yet the fines were set against accounts that hid assets they had already moved beyond easy pursuit. A few collaborators were punished, others quietly retained influence. The county tasted something like repair, but also recognized the limits of legal remedy. The twins watched these partial victories with an adult patience that tempered hope. They had pressed for full exposure. They had forced an institutional inventory that would not have occurred without them. Still, they felt the gnaw of unfinished business names that could not be made to name their guilt, deeds that remained lost, families whose grief could not be undone by ledger corrections. Their work shifted to preservation, copying documents, teaching record-keeping, and establishing networks to guard memory. Public perception shifted unevenly. Some hailed the twins as saviors, their deformity refigured into moral currency. Others could not escape old superstitions and suspected the twins of being signs of divine mockery or unnatural consequence. The Harrows' defenders murmured that the twins were instruments of a vendetta, products of a priest's imagination. Yet the written proofs and the memories of those who had reclaimed land made rumor less sustainable. Eventually the Harrows retreated to a smaller manor, their legend rewritten by apologists. They lived on remnants while new statutes slowly reduced similar abuses over decades. The Harrows' story did not end with fines and faded fame. It became an instruction, sometimes of resistance, sometimes of caution. Communities began to record claims with formal witnesses. Registries became more careful. Ministers who had once kept silent found pressure to answer. The twins' teachings, how to trace paper, how to document memory, how to convert recollection into admissible fact, were institutionalized in small ways: clerk training, town witness lists, and a culture that questioned sudden wealth. Yet the apparatus that enabled extraction proved adaptable. Where direct seizure had been visible, later innovations made appropriation subtler. Trusts and convoluted sales, proxy holders, complex debts, legal forms learned to wear multiple faces. The Harrows had been surgical. Their methods evolved into systems that used language and accounting as the blade and the sheath. Where communities strengthened record-keeping, the new predators innovated faster ledgers and offshore havens. The twins responded not merely with law but with education. They founded small gatherings in village halls where tradespeople learned bookkeeping, where young men learned to compare copies, where women taught neighbors to memorize boundaries and record oral testimony. They were not merely witnesses, They were teachers of civic mechanics. Their deformities, once a reason for seclusion, became a human magnet that made people listen to what they said and look harder at what others had done. Powerful interests did not disappear. They adapted. Some sought to placate by offering patronage, others attempted to co-opt the twins by flattering them or promising safety. The twins refused most offers, accepting only those that expanded the archive or the network of witnesses. Their selective alliances made them targets for rumor and for legal harassment. Often they were accused again of stirring trouble rather than healing the wound. Through it all, the central axiom remained: accusation can be manufactured, and once manufactured it becomes infrastructure. To resist requires constant vigilance, a public that reads ledgers, a clergy that is willing to probe its own ties, and legal systems that prioritize transparency over convenience. The twins' life work was to teach those habits. Over decades, these habits produced folklore, local registers that survived war, public memorials to wronged families, and a wary civic memory that sometimes prevented similar schemes from taking root. Plus oral testimony. Beneath the account books and court filings lay rituals that had once cloaked seizure in meaning. The Harrows and those like them staged processions, lit candles, and timed calamities to produce a narrative of moral necessity. These were not random superstitions, but calibrated performances: a prayer before a seizure, a procession after a conviction, an ostentatious penance to soothe a suspicious crowd. Such rituals turn theft into sacrament. They lend ceremony to dispossession. Recognizing ritual as technology changed how Benedict and the twins approached reform. It was not enough to unmask ledgers. The community also had to learn that spectacle could be manufactured to justify greed. They taught citizens to see the choreography, who was given prominence in a procession, which families were conveniently excluded from prayers, which alms were timed to influence testimony. Once spectators learned to read theater, the magic of ritual diminished. This discovery had consequences. Some ministers who had relied on ritual for parish unity felt accused and defensive. Others embraced the critique and demanded transparency in church dealings. Merchants who had profited from ritualized transfers found their markets questioned. Some reformed, some recast their maneuvers in more complex legal forms. The pattern shifted but did not disappear. Human appetite for advantage finds new venues when old ones are closed. The twins also found that knowledge alone could be dangerous. Revealing ritual practices risked inflaming communities and creating new cycles of accusation. When Benedict published a pamphlet describing a sequence of staged penances used to intimidate witnesses, some townspeople cheered, while others feared renewed turmoil. Disclosure heals but also disturbs. Knowledge requires management. The twins learned strategy: selectively publish, protect witnesses, and create institutions that could hold both truth and stability. They broke down psychological control into steps: isolate a target, manufacture a moral panic, recruit reputational allies to testify, and then use legal language to naturalize the dispossession. By teaching communities these steps, the twins turned the Harrows Manual into an instruction on defense rather than exploitation and recovery. Section 17. Listen closely. The techniques we have named are not exotic. They are instruments of everyday governance when left unchecked. Psychological control operates by structuring perception. Begin with ambiguity and then fill it with accusation. Make the accused's reputation ambiguous, then layer on ritualized condemnation and official sanction until the public begins to accept dispossession as inevitable. Repeat often enough and the community learns to police itself, weaponizing neighbor against neighbor. To resist this is to retrain perception. The twins taught simple practices. Demand receipts for transfers, require witnesses from outside the immediate social web, record testimony contemporaneously, archive copies in multiple locales. They taught that communities must cultivate institutional redundancies, multiple clerks, independent registrars, rotating oversight committees, so that no single node of power can convert rumor into property. Small structural changes attenuate the potency of accusation. There is an ethical current running beneath the technical fixes. When accusation becomes a currency, empathy can be a casualty. People will accept moral shortcuts when they believe themselves safe or morally pure. The twins insisted on humility, acknowledge that communities are imperfect, that old men and women may have been complicit, and that rebuilding requires open records and restorative practices that include both restitution and reconciliation. Practically, this means creating rituals of repair to replace rituals of seizure, public inventories, formal apologies recorded and archived, community councils that mediate disputes transparently, and rotating panels to oversee claims. It also means educating children in the mechanics of record, keeping so that knowledge is not concentrated in the hands of a few. The twins believe that literacy in civic mechanics is itself an act of liberation. Start small, demand public ledgers, support independent local registrars, insist that charities publish donors, and back civic literacy programs. If you live where institutions obscure ownership, ask for audits, record oral histories of dispossessed families, and teach younger people to keep copies of vital documents in safe places and teach others always years folded on years. The twins aged in a world that had learned, in fits and starts, to read ledgers differently. They never became public celebrities. Their presence never conformed to simple narratives. Instead, they became custodians, quiet, principled keepers of a dispersed archive. They arranged copies of evidence in churches, in merchants' safes, in the trunks of farmers who had reclaimed gates. They taught apprentices how to recognize forged marginalia and how to interrogate signatures. Their bodies remained a map of otherness. They moved with difficulty and often required assistance. Yet their minds remained precise instruments. They developed methods to index records using tactile cues, writing systems that a blind clerk could follow, and not systems to mark pages in ways that hid content from casual eyes but could be decoded by the initiated. Over time, their techniques spread. Registrars adopted redundant indexing schemes, and parish clerks used certified seals that were harder to forge. Not all outcomes were noble. Power resists, and sometimes it consumes. A few allied families, hungry for stability, co-opted portions of the twins' archive, claiming stewardship while keeping parts sealed. Some papers vanished into private collections, others were traded quietly among merchants. The Harrow's remaining networks attempted to resurface by sponsoring philanthropic ventures that masked commercial aims. The twins confronted this reality with a weary clarity. Reform is iterative, rarely clean. One twin grew ill in a year of famine and did not recover. The community that had learned to listen to them came to the bedside, reading aloud preserved testimonies and recounting restitution stories. The passing was mourned, and the surviving twin, in the dim days that followed, centralized the archive further, copies in 3 regions, abridged indexes distributed publicly, and a final instruction to those who would guard the work. The instruction was simple and brutal. Remember the mechanics of accusation and preservation, pass them on for hidden truth. Centuries shift the grammar of theft, but not the grammar of concealment. Stones still stand on wind-bitten coasts with names half erased, and fishermen still cross themselves when they pass. Descendants of families who profited sometimes sit on boards of trade. Other descendants tend the mills their ancestors reclaimed. The ledger pages the twins spread have aged into brittle artifacts. Some are stored in archives under catalogue numbers, others in unremarked boxes in parish basements. Where the Harrows once moved openly, modern equivalents operate through complex financial instruments and opaque corporate shells. The specifics change, numbers move faster, ownership is hidden in jurisdictions that answer to no county court. But the structure persists, manufacture ambiguity, exploit legal gaps, drown dissent in paperwork. Institutions that should act as checks sometimes act as lubricants, smoothing transfer and promising order, while quietly eroding accountability. The twins' story offers a method of seeing. When you encounter sudden scandal that seems timed to a profitable outcome, ask who benefits. When you see a ritual of outrage and a sudden legal claim, consider whether spectacle is serving extraction. Audit the language of accusation. Is it specific or broad? Are witnesses independent or connected to beneficiaries? The lesson is not paranoia, it is civic literacy. Learn to read the lines. These insights travel beyond rural courts. Corporate mergers that acquire community lands, political purges that silence inconvenient critics, and philanthropic foundations that mask donor influence. Each can be scrutinized with the same questions the twins taught. The methods of resistance are similar too. distributed documentation, redundant witnesses, public registries, and a culture that demands transparency over deference. The twins' ledgers became a metaphor and a manual. If you visit the coastal marker now, you will find it partly reclaimed by lichen, its letters softened. Yet some locals maintain a small bundle of copied pages in a pew box, like talismans. They are not relics of superstition but instruments of memory. Remember that systems of extraction depend on forgetting. Practically, support public registers that disclose beneficial ownership, back investigative reporting that follows money trails, pressure elected officials for audit powers, and help local archives digitize records, teach neighbors to preserve deeds, urge charities to publish donors, and foster community councils that monitor transfers and keep watch for hidden rents. This story is not a closed book, but a method for reading books that seem finished. The Harrows were clever, their methods were practical and teachable. What is terrifying is not their cruelty but their replicability. Institutions reshape themselves to absorb advantage. Rituals that seemed pious mask techniques of transfer, laws intended to secure community can be bent to serve extraction. Our task, then, is not only to name villains but to attune ourselves to the mechanics they used. If you have listened this far, your gaze has already been altered. You will notice ledgers where others see lineage, patterns where others see providence. This is not cynicism, it is the discipline of civic vision. We must train to see how accusation can be weaponized, how legal forms can hide transfers, and how sympathy can be purchased to silence scrutiny. The twins taught us how to translate fear into record and record into resistance. Remember that transformation requires both courage and routine. Courage mobilizes the first witness. Routine preserves the 1,000 small acts that build a resilient archive. Teach your children to ask for receipts. Encourage your local clerks to duplicate records. Support the small civic rituals that convert memory into evidence, public inventories, sworn lists, rotating oversight. These are not glamorous gestures, but they are durable. There are costs. Those who benefit from opacity will push back. There will be legal wrangling and slander. There will be nights of fear and faded coffers, yet the alternative is to accept that some will always profit from others' forgetfulness. The twins refused that bargain. Their deformities became an unlikely pedagogy, a visible truth that forced questions to be asked and name to be reclaimed. In the end, history leaves markers, stones, ledgers, tales whispered along coasts. It also leaves a method. Look for seams, trace the paper, nurture witnesses, duplicate records, and refuse to treat accusation as inevitable. If you want to carry this forward, keep what you've heard in mind, teach it to the next person, and treat memory like metal. Hammer it until it holds shape. When enough of us do so, the machinery of extraction will find fewer places to hide. On the cliff where the old stone stands, fishermen now leave a ledger copy beneath the rock. Carry this practice, teach, archive, pass on the habit of remembering that honors them and keep watch for hidden rents